Yo, what's going on, everybody? It's McCreepers, and in today's video, we are going to be doing the in-depth review of the newest Vanguard unit, Sun Jin-woo and Icarus. And for the rest of the video, I will just be calling him Sun Jin-woo. In this video, we will be looking over his stats, how much he costs, his passives, his abilities, and some tips on how to use him effectively. To begin, Sun Jin-woo is a unit with the unknown element, which grants him immunity to status effects and ailments. He also is a 3-placement unit, making him the first and only Vanguard unit in the game to be multi-placement. This also makes it so that he is pretty much viable with almost any single trait. Moving on, Sun Jin-woo will cost 1700 to place, and his placement stats will be 9790 damage, have a 6.3 second SBA, and will have 33.5 range, and will unlock his first 2 shadows, Arise and Bear. At upgrade 3, which will cost 10,900 yen, Sun Jin-woo will unlock his second attack, and his new stats are 12,240 damage, 4.2 second SBA, 39.1 range. On top of this, he unlocks his first nuke called Sun Jin-woo, which will do 200% of his damage, and he also unlocks another shadow called Steel. At upgrade 6, he ends up getting a third attack, which will cost 29,900 yen, and his new stats are 22,380 damage, with a 5.1 second SBA and a 47.5. With this upgrade, he gets his second nuke called Icarus, which does 600% of his damage, and he also unlocks another shadow called Healer. At upgrade 10, Sun Jin-woo unlocks his final attack, which will at this point cost 75,400 yen, and his new stats are 46,860 damage, 6.8 second SPA, and 58.6 range. This upgrade also comes with his third nuke called Duo, which is a nuke that does 1,000% of his damage, and he also unlocks his final shadow, Beru. His final upgrade is unlocked at upgrade 12, and his max stats at this point will be 57,350 damage, 6.8 second SBA, with 64.2 range, and will cost a total of 105,700 yen. So in order to max out 2, it will cost 211,400 yen, and to max out all 3, it will cost 317,100 yen. Now, moving on, I'm going to talk about his passives and abilities, which is probably the point where some of you guys may get a little bit confused, since there is a lot to it, but I'll do my best to simplify it for you guys to understand. Sun Jin-woo is given 3 different passives called the Army Supply, the General, and the Monarch. However, all of these kind of work together and synergize together to kind of buff his shadows, which is like kind of his main ability. So I'll kind of go over the passives when they're like relevant. As mentioned earlier, the whole thing with Sun Jin-woo is he has a ability called Shadows, which essentially are just how he summons his servants, I guess, or summons. And how this works is that on placement, you get access to the Shadows menu, but in order to actually summon a shadow, you need mana, but you are given a full mana bar, and these mana bars are also considered local, so every single Sun Jin-woo will have their own mana bar. And you gain 2% of your mana back for every single enemy that you kill, and this can be any enemy, and any person that kills an enemy, you will still get mana, so you don't have to worry about really ever being out of mana and you gain it back so quickly. Now let's talk about the actual shadows and kind of what they do. The first shadow you'll see when you open the menu is Arise, and essentially what this does is it summons enemies that you kill. These summons health will actually scale with the summons initial health when you killed the enemy. This will be really similar to Sun Jin-woo's mythic ability, where the summons just end up scaling with the enemies that you have killed before. And in terms of mana cost, this will depend based on how much health the enemy had before killing. If the more health they have, the more mana it will take to actually summon them. So the weaker they are, the less mana it costs. The stronger they are, the more it costs. And at some point, it will cost 100 mana to spawn one shadow using Arise. Now, for the rest of the shadows,
and they gang up in passive swarms.
Based on the amount of mana you have when you actually summon your shadows. And I'll kind of get into detail how those modifiers work later on, since I think it'll make a little bit more sense. But moving on to the next shadow, we have Bear. This is a summon that you get on placement with Sun Jin Woo, and he will have a base of 2 times Sun Jin Woo's damage. However, if you summon him with 100 mana, he will spawn with 3.2 times Sun Jin Woo's damage as health. The next shadow we have is Steel, who unlocks at upgrade 3, and also typically spawns with 2 times of Sun Jin Woo damage and acts as a trap. Similar to Bear, if you have 100 mana, instead of 2 times, he will spawn in with 3.2 times Sun Jin Woo's damage. And what Steel does is that he will spawn at the end of Sun Jin Woo's range, and he will sit there and act as a trap, and gains 2% of his max health back every single second, up to 300% health. So once he is fully built, he will have 4 times of his initial summon health. So if he is spawned with 100,000 health, once he's fully built up, he'll have a total of 400,000 health. His next shadow is called Healer, which is unlocked at upgrade 6 and will spawn in with 0.5 or half of Sun Jin Woo's damage. And with 100 mana, he will end up spawning in with 0.8 times Sun Jin Woo's damage. And what the healer does is that as he moves along the track, every 5 seconds, he will heal all of the other summons by 5% of their max health. And then lastly, we have Barrow, who is going to be probably the best summon here, but he is unlocked at upgrade 10 and initially spawns in with 1.5 times Sun Jin Woo's damage as health. And then with 100 mana, he'll spawn in with 2.4 times Sun Jin Woo's damage. This summon will end up doing an attack that is directly tied to Sun Jin Woo's stats. So if your Sun Jin Woo is doing 50k damage, every single time Beru attacks,
Look. Lingango, liguli, guli, wata, lingango, liguli, wata, lingango.
Sorry for the interruption, your show will resume shortly. A few other things he does. The next thing he does is that pretty much every single time you spawn in a new barrel, it will spawn in with 5% more health as the previous one. And this caps at a total of 200%. So essentially, once he is fully built up, he will end up spawning in with 3 times Sun Jin Woo's damage. But if you have 100 mana, he will spawn in for 4.8 times Sun Jin Woo's damage once he's fully built. But it's not done yet. Alright, so this is post-production McReapers, because I did a really bad job of explaining how the essentially mana multipliers work in regards to increasing health of your summons. So real quickly, I'm going to do a little demonstration here. Alright, so we have our Sun Jin Woo here, and this is his mana bar. So it takes 40 mana to summon one of your essentially shadows, so you're left with a max of 60. And this is going to act as a base percentage. And since 60 is the max that you can have and the lowest you can have is 1%, how this works is that if you have 100 mana and you decide to summon a bear, that's your bear. Because bear typically has a 2 times health multiplier. And you spawn him with 100, he will get a 60% multiplier. So you're going to multiply 2 times 6.6, which will give you 1.2, and then you add that to the first, the initial. So that's where you get 3.2 from. And like I said, you can do this with that's how it works for the buffing. But yeah, hopefully that helps, and enjoy the rest of the video. Alright, real quickly, I made a chart to kind of more explain, or just as a follow-up to what I just said. So essentially, let's say you have 80 mana and you summon bear. It will be, and bear typically has a 2 times health modifier. You will spawn in bear with 40% more of that 2 times, or 2.8 times the health. So that's, you can stop and look at this, and I think you guys can understand hopefully a little bit better. But yeah. Hey, guess what? Yeah, I just post editing McReapers again. My dumbass forgot to mention that summons can do crit damage, which is why Deadeye is probably Sun Jin Woo's best trait. That's something I didn't mention in the video that I just wanted to throw in here real quickly, just so you guys know. So yeah, Deadeye is unironically his best trait, but Monarch is his second best trait. Now, there are a few more passives we need to talk about. The first one being the passive he gets was his first passive, which essentially every single time Sun Jin Woo loses mana, he gains 0.5% damage up to 60%. So in other words, he needs to spawn in a total of 60 summons or shadows in order to get that buff, and this will be a permanent buff, by the way. The next passive will give Sun Jin Woo 5% damage any single time an ally summon dies within his range. However, this damage does reset upon attack, so it's not going to be super noticeable unless you end up using the Beru Familiar, which just consumes the 5 weakest summons, and this will actually apply, or I guess activate this passive, so you're going to be getting a guaranteed 25% extra damage per attack pretty much if you're using Beru. But that being said, it's still going to be kind of limited because it's just, you probably don't want to really use Beru too much just because he can consume Yamamoto clones, which obviously isn't really wanted. Next passive gives Sun Jin Woo a 20% range buff and a 30% damage buff if he isn't summoning any units. And this is kind of separate per Sun Jin Woo, since every Sun Jin Woo has their own local kind of cooldowns other than their nukes. That's all shared. Essentially, if you have one Sun Jin Woo summoning, they're not going to get affected by this buff. However, if you have two other Sun Jin Woos that aren't summoning any units, they will get affected by this buff. And as I already kind of mentioned, Sun Jin Woo has a total of 3 nukes. However, these are once per match abilities. You can only use them one time a match, and are global cooldown. So if you're playing with multiple people, you're just going to want the person. If you're playing with someone who have Monarch, he's going to be the one to activate the abilities to get the most damage out of them. And as I mentioned, these 3 nukes will do 200% damage, 600% damage, and 1000% damage. And real quickly, I'll play all 3 of them here on screen for you guys.
Look. Lingango, liguli, wata, lingango, liguli, wata, lingango.
Alrighty, now this is the point of the video where I'll kind of show you guys how to maximize both Jin Woo's damage as well as his summon using only him without any external buffs from Gazelle, because obviously your Gazelle is going to give massive amounts of damage to his summons. But starting off, what you're going to want to do is on placement, what you want to do is you want to turn on Arise, because we want to get this 30% damage buff from his first passive as soon as possible. The faster we get it, the better, because you have to remember this is permanent. So while that's setting up, you can just upgrade your unit normally. The only thing you cannot do is do not summon Steel. Wait until Steel. I'll tell you when to summon Steel, but now you're just going to wait for the 30% to get up. Once it's up, you can summon really whoever you want except Steel. I will say though, if you're someone who's using the Beru Familiar, you might benefit from just keeping Arise on until you have your Sun Jin Woo max. Just because these other summons don't really do too much, so the extra damage just might be more beneficial. Alright, so I have the first passive maxed out and I upgrade him to max. Your damage will say, yeah, the base multiplier is 1.3, but since I'm using Beru, the Familiar anyway, it kind of varies from time to time. And now once you have your Sun Jin Woo maxed out, what you're going to want to do is you want to get Beru's 50% damage as soon as possible, because once again that will just furthermore buff your just all around summons with this guy. And the reason why you want to wait for Steel until this is because you want to summon Steel with the most ideal conditions possible. And you can see here Beru's now at 50%. So now what we're going to do is we're going to wait for Beru to die. And you'll see we still get that 30% damage buff that no enemies are alive. Now this is technically the ideal condition to spawn Steel in, because this is a max damage you can get. You'll see Sun Jin Woo has a 110 damage buff at this point. So this is the most amount of damage you can get using just Sun Jin Woo, but if you have damage buffers, you can increase this to make Steel even tankier. But at this point, you can summon Steel, and you'll see back here, he spawned in with 290k, and he's getting about around 6,000 every second. So this will add up over time, and I'll show you guys what the damage or health is looking like at the end. All right, so you can see a fully built up Steel will be doing around 1.2 million damage, and just like I said, purely with Sun Jin Woo solely. No Gazelle buff, no damage buff. But let's go see, I guess, real quickly what a Gazelle buff Steel would look like. All right, well, that's interesting. Steel won't be affected by Gazelle if he's standing still. I'm gonna go check real quick if he will get the buff like when you first spawn him and he walked backwards. So I guess Gazelle doesn't work on Steel. I don't know if she works or he works on other summons, but it looks like he ends up spawning in with less health than before. I think the other summons are still get affected by it, so just keep that in mind. Steel is kind of broken. Alright, so the last time I'm going to show you guys before the end of the video is, some numbers, because it's not a McReapers video if we don't have numbers, right? But essentially what we have here is kind of Sun Jin Woo's like maxed out stats with both with summons and without, and you can see kind of the difference here. You can see the DPS difference is around 1700, 1900 ish. And then obviously we have essentially these are like the highest you can get your summons, like each shadow. This is like the most health they can get up to while only using Jinwoo. Obviously, if you are using Monarch, these will be much higher, about 3 times higher is just the best way to do it. But yeah, you can see Bear spawns in was around 290 to 300. Steel can spawn in was around 1.2. Healer can spawn was around 70 to 75k, and then Bear spawns was like around 440 to 450 is kind of the range I've been seeing with them. And like I said, this is without any external buffs. This is just only using within Sun Jin Woo's kit. Not to mention you can have 3 of these guys down at the same like you with 3 Jin, yeah. 3 Jin Woos, you can have, triple this pretty much, so almost equivalent to Monarch. But yeah, that's where I'm in the video, and like always, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.
Look. Lingango, lingango,